It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Brad Wilcox, author of Get Married. Brad is a professor of sociology at the University of Virginia, where he directs the National Marriage Project. He is the author or co-author of 6 books, is that right? Or is this the 7th book? Somewhere, this is the 6th book? Okay. Numerous peer-reviewed journals, and also frequents the pages of such publications as The Atlantic, New York Times, Wall Street Journal. He earned his PhD from Princeton and is the Future Freedom Fellow at the Institute for Family Studies and a non-resident fellow, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. More importantly, Brad is a dad, and he is a husband as well. And Brad, welcome to Cardus.
Thank you.
I've been following, as Brian says, I've been sort of doing family policy work for nearly 2 decades, and I think all that time I've been reading your work, Brad, and I appreciate it. And I appreciate that you're conversant in scholarly academic circles, in policy, conversant in policy circles, and then able to also communicate in the public square and in popular publications. So I just, by way of introduction, I want to know what drew you as a young Brad Wilcox to study sociology and into the career path that you've taken.
Yeah, thanks, Peter John. It's great to be here tonight. So I was raised by a single mother, and as a kind of a young student at UVA, where I am now a professor, kind of had the sense that marriage was kind of an institution that connected men to their families on average. And this is kind of more of an intuition in college that I had. And I also had a professor my senior year at UVA who was a really gifted sociologist, James Hunter. And it was kind of being in his class that kind of led me to move away from politics, which was my major at UVA, and to think about a PhD in sociology. And kind of, I think the basic thought there was that politics is really downstream oftentimes of culture, and that if I'm interested kind of in understanding what's happening in the world, I should focus more on culture and less on politics per se. So that was kind of a motivating conclusion that I came to as an undergraduate, and then went to Princeton for graduate school in sociology, where I studied religion, family, and culture at Princeton. So that's the quick answer.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, very good. So perhaps it's because I am a polite Canadian, but the title of your new book, Get Married, Why Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization, strikes me as very direct and very urgent. So what is your book about?
Well, so that's good. So I was, I was moving into this whole arena for many, many years because I was concerned about kind of marriage and its impact upon children. Primarily. But as I've been kind of speaking to undergraduates at UVA, particularly undergraduate women, I've had kind of like the growing sense that there is, sort of a sense of almost foreboding among a lot of young women that I've been speaking to at UVA. They're kind of worried about their prospects for dating and for marriage and for family life more generally. And so this kind of led me to think more about the ways in which marriage matters not just for kids, but really matters for adults. And that we could do a better job, I think, of kind of both making the case for marriage with an eye towards adults, and then also kind of equipping them with some of the kind of values and virtues and resources that would make them more successful as spouses. So this book, is really focused more on making the case to adults and kind of less on focusing on the impact of marriage on children. And also, if you read the book, you have a couple of insights about how to forge a strong and stable marriage in the book as well.
These are all themes that we're going to swing back to for sure. I do want to ask though, because this is something that I've observed, but I want to see what your opinion is. But as a sociologist who's been working in this field for quite some time, do you think the public discourse on marriage and how we talk about marriage and its function with society, has that conversation changed, or has it been cyclical, or maybe it's just stayed the same?
I think it has kind of been somewhat cyclical. I mean, I think that there was a moment in the mid-1990s when we had a number of scholars in the US, for instance, people like Bill Galston, who was at Brookings in Maryland, still is at Brookings now, kind of making the case for marriage and family. And they kind of fell out of fashion for a period of time. In the early 2000s, there was another push. My mentor at Princeton, Sarah McClanahan, and Isabel Saho at Brookings were part of that conversation in the early 2000s. And then I think really in the last decade, marriage has kind of lost ground again, in part because of the more kind of radically progressive turn that a lot of our societies have taken since 2014. But I think we're kind of maybe hitting a moment now again where people are kind of reconsidering the value of marriage. So my book has gotten 4 different articles in the New York Times in less than a year, which is I think just because there's interest in the institution again. The Washington Post had an op-ed written by the editorial board not too long ago, kind of lamenting the growing ideological polarization between young women on the one hand and young men on the other, with an eye towards how it's affecting marriage in a negative way. So I think there's kind of more interest yet again in marriage among some of our elites that I'm encouraged by, and of course hope that we can kind of make something of, not just in a few key journalistic outlets, but across the broader society in the U.S., and then the same thing would be true for Canada as well.
That tracks with what I think I've been seeing, and I think your book comes along at I'm almost just the right moment to further that conversation and to really inspire that conversation. So when we're talking about marriage, you differentiate some different views or different ways that people approach marriage. In the book and your previous work talks a little bit about the soulmate model of marriage and then a family-first model of marriage. So help me understand what you're talking about when you talk about the soulmate model of marriage.
Yeah, so I talk in the book about what I call like the soulmate myth. It's kind of this idea that marriage is about some intense romantic or emotional connection. That you got kind of like the butterflies in the stomach when you meet someone, and you're just really sort of hitting all cylinders, and you have the sense too that this person is like a perfect fit for you. There's no real conflict between you and your boyfriend or girlfriend, you and your wife or your husband. But I think if you kind of just sort of stop at that point, you don't necessarily appreciate that marriage, for instance, is much more than an emotional or romantic connection. It's about, in the family first model, recognizing that there's an economic operation running in your marriage, that there is a way in which you're there as a source of social support for your spouse. You're there for your larger kinship network oftentimes, and then especially you're there for any kids that you might bring into your union. And so kind of the family first model kind of sees marriage as sort of advancing many different goods and not just romance. But I think in our current culture, really, especially since the 1970s, there are plenty of folks and there are plenty of pop cultural outlets that want to kind of keep people thinking about marriage primarily in terms of that romantic relationship. I think that the challenge or the problem with that kind of perspective is that sort of feelings are a fragile foundation for a long-term marriage. And I begin my chapter on the soulmate myth by talking about the book Eat, Pray, Love, written by Elizabeth Gilbert. And she's kind of like she perfectly kind of articulates the sort of soulmate approach to love. And it's kind of no accident that she's gone through a couple of marriages and I think is currently single, because again, I think she sees marriage as kind of like this intense emotional connection with someone. And if there's any difficulty or any kind of friction, then that might mean that we're really not soulmates, or that this isn't really kind of the love that I expected. Whereas if you have kind of a richer and more institutional model of love, of marital love, you understand that there are many goods that are realized in marriage. And then two, I think to bring in St. Thomas Aquinas, you would see marriage as an opportunity to prioritize the good of the other. That's what love is. It's not a feeling. It's kind of willing the good of the other is what really married love is about.
I think some might push back and say, well, you have the soulmate model, and sort of pursuing your own individual happiness allows you to leave like bad relationships and then find the right relationship and find deeper happiness. The example you just given us, though, would seem actually the opposite. That this is a bit
right. So obviously there are obviously marriages that are extremely difficult or dangerous, and these are ones where marriage can be an obstacle to human flourishing. But I think what people who kind of look at marriage through this more romanticized prism don't appreciate is that if you're kind of looking at marriage, I think as Liz Gilbert has done, as an opportunity to kind of directly pursue happiness or that intention, emotional feeling, it's like a chimera. You're constantly pursuing it, but you're kind of never realizing it. And I think by contrast, those folks who are trying to be good spouses and good parents in the context of a rich marriage and family life are more likely, paradoxically, to be happy most of the time, satisfied most of the time, content most of the time, and more so than their fellow folks, Canadians or Americans, who would think about marriage primarily in that more romantic or soulmate-y way. And in fact, I do have data in the book that kind of shows that people who have a more kind of family-first model are more likely to be kind of stably married in terms of their perception, but also happily married and then happy with their lives, I think, more generally as well.
Say that the data, tell me if I'm getting this right, is maybe shifted in that previously we've seen data suggest that maybe married parents were maybe less happy, but we've seen a shift now. And I wanted to ask you about that. Why do you think that is? Are we measuring happiness differently? What do we mean by happiness as well? It would be another question. What is it that we're measuring and what's changed?
So I kind of termed the book chapter on parenthood, the parenthood trap. And there's certainly a lot of discourse in media and in the academy that sort of would suggest that parents are less happy than their childless fellow citizens. But we've seen really since 2000, at least in the US, a trend where, generally speaking, parents are reporting more happiness than their fellow childless peers. And it's not actually that parents are more happy now than they were back before 2000. It's that childless adults are less happy today than they were before 2000. And so we don't know precisely why this is happening. It could be partly what we call a selection effect, where the kinds of people who are now selecting into parenthood are maybe a bit different in ways, more advantaged perhaps in some ways than the childless peers. But I think part of the story here is that we're obviously living in a world that's more afflicted by these devices, and where we have fewer opportunities, partly as a consequence, to be in community, both in religious and secular forms of community that would kind of ground and guide our lives in ways that would be rich and meaningful. And so I think actually in the moment that we're living in and kind of moving towards, it may well be the case that marriage and parenthood are becoming more valuable because they remain primary sources of social solidarity for adults in a time and a place where other sources of solidarity are more and more out of reach for people than would have been the case 30 or 40 years ago in Canada or in the United States. So bottom line is, I just think that, and speaking personally for a second, I mean, my wife and I have a lot of kids, and it's very stressful at times. It's, a lot of lost sleep and all that kind of stuff. But we are never lonely. And at the end of the day, I think that that makes us, generally speaking, happier people. So it would be kind of the personal riff on that question. So.
I know that the book is focusing and aimed more at speaking to adults, but before we sort of move on, I do want to kind of loop back just on some of the data in terms of outcomes for kids that grow up in intact married parent families. This has kind of come up again with Melissa Kearney's book, The Two-Parent Advantage, Privilege, I guess. What does the data say on that? How can you kind of summarize that for us?
So one of the things that we kind of see both in the academy and in kind of journalism is what I call kind of the family diversity theory. And that is this idea that every family form is kind of equally valuable for our kids, that, single, step, cohabiting, married, are all kind of roughly equivalent when it comes to the welfare of kids. And that what matters for our children is not kind of a particular family structure, but just sufficient love and money. So our kids, again, they just need love and money. They don't need necessarily married parents. And yet when you kind of look at the data, what you find is that kids are much more likely on average to thrive in intact married households. And one of the more striking examples of that in my book is that I looked with my colleague, Dr. Wendy Wang, at young men in different family forms in the United States. What we found was that young men who were being raised in any kind of non-intact biological family were more likely to spend some time in jail or in prison than they were to graduate from college in the States. And by contrast, young men who were from intact families were about 4 times more likely in this data set to graduate from college than they were to spend any time in jail or in prison. So it's just kind of a very striking illustration for me, kind of looking at the numbers of the way in which there's a strong connection between family structure and child well-being, and boys and girls, in different ways are more likely to flourish, boys especially socially and educationally, and girls emotionally when they've got the benefit of both their married parents, at home. And then to kind of return to the love and money point, I think what oftentimes the left doesn't appreciate is that, yes, love and money are incredibly important for our kids, but on average, kids get more love in terms of more attention, more affection, and more consistent discipline from their intact married parents than they do from alternatives. And they also tend to get a lot more financial support from their intact married parents than they would in other alternative arrangements. So if you have the view, as many on the left do, that what matters for our kids is love and money, I think you need to also appreciate that our kids are most likely to get that from their own married parents. And again, I say this, someone who was raised by a single mom, and recognize that a lot of kids end up flourishing outside of an intact married family. But I'm also a sociologist, and on average, our kids are more likely to benefit from having their own parents at home for the duration.
Thanks. In the book, you do outline from your research, you find that individuals from particular groups, or maybe with specific shared characteristics, are more likely to marry and stay married. And that was from, I can't remember which survey it was that you looked at that, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you found.
So what we see in a lot of the psychological research and commentary on marriage and family life is that there's sort of like certain keys to strong relationships. This is maybe for some of the folks here who've just gotten engaged. So John Gottman is a psychologist, for instance, at the University of Washington. He kind of talks about the importance of avoiding what he calls the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And these are things like contemptuous behavior. And of course, right now you might be smiling at that idea, but once you've been married 28 years, like I have, there might be moments in your marriage when you're struggling with these little apocalypse characters. But he also talks too about kind of the importance of recognizing, for the average couple, having at least 5 positive interactions for every negative interaction is like a hallmark of a good relationship or a good marriage. But the broader point here is that Gottman has a lot of kind of insights about kind of some discrete behaviors that tend to forge strong marriages, but doesn't really have kind of an appreciation for the way in which couples are embedded in larger social contexts. So as a sociologist, I'm thinking about the way in which class and culture, for instance, really are important in shaping the contexts of either stronger or weaker marriages and families. And so what I do is identify 4 groups of Americans who are more likely to be succeeding at marriage today. And those are Asian Americans, those are the faithful religious Americans, those are strivers or college-educated Americans, and then finding that they're conservative Americans. And to be honest, Peter John, when I first started the project, I would just have those first 3, just basically the religious, the college-educated, and the Asian American groups. But as I was kind of running numbers with Dr. Wang, we found that once you threw an ideology into our models in the general social survey primarily, big US data set, we would find that ideology was independently predictive now of both getting married and then being happily married in the States. And so we added the conservative group as the 4th group that's more successful. And there's a lot going on with those 4 groups, but I would just sort of say, and maybe you've got more questions on this, but there's kind of a class piece and a culture piece that kind of encompasses those 4 groups in many ways. So on the class side, that I would say they tend to have men, again, men in their communities who are gainfully employed, especially employed full-time in ways that tend to make them more attractive as potential husbands, and then less likely to run into trouble as a couple and as a family because the guy is stably employed. I think that's a current you see across those 4 groups. And then culturally, I think, particularly the Asian Americans, religious Americans, and conservative Americans explicitly oftentimes appreciate the value of marriage and the commitments, that tend to undergird marriage. And then implicitly, oftentimes, for the college-educated set, they tend to have some more implicit appreciation for some of these values and virtues as well.
So definitely, yeah, holding those values. And I've come to think that marriage is a social institution that requires the support or benefits from the support of other social institutions, other communities. So it's not surprising to think that you would find that in religious communities where maybe that help and support is more readily available. That sort of makes intuitive sense to me. But to I guess, experience these marriages, you have to get married first. And I feel like, or at least what I'm kind of reading or seeing, that may be a bit more difficult these days, or certainly there are barriers there. So I want to ask you a little bit about that. Last week in the Globe and Mail, there was a number of articles, I think because we're getting into wedding season, talking about weddings. And one article was noting that trend among Canadians to simplify their weddings, partly because of rising costs, but also in addition to this kind of simplicity of trying to make the experience very unique and very much about the individual couple. And there's this quote that kind of caught me in the article. It says, as Vancouver wedding planner Alicia Keats puts it, the rise in non-traditional weddings comes with a new ideology. There's no wrong way to celebrate. The trend with other couples is that they and their wedding, the trend with our couples, she's a wedding planner, is that they want their wedding to be unique and reflective of themselves. They don't want anything cookie cutter or something that has been done to death before. And I think it's really interesting that she used the word ideology, that there's like a system of belief or ideas that are bringing to the way that we celebrate a wedding. Now, a wedding does not a marriage make necessarily. Its relationship is different from a wedding. But I'm wondering if there's something about the trends in the way that we celebrate weddings that sort of reflects something that we believe about marriages and enter weddings. And I wonder if maybe that's part of the soulmate model. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or even research on that question.
Yeah, it's actually a pretty penetrating question. I think that our weddings do actually tell a lot about us, how we kind of celebrate this transition from being single to being married is pretty important. And obviously in a variety of different contexts, like we just had college graduations at UVA, it's all about kind of signaling that you're moving from being an unlettered person to being a lettered person at UVA, for instance. So I do think the character of weddings matter. And I would, not surprisingly argue that, oftentimes if you're kind of crafting your own wedding, you're kind of losing touch with some deeper traditions, that might be articulated, obviously, for instance, like in a religious context, that there are certain ways in which the vows that have been articulated are capturing, deep insights into the human condition, love, marriage, and family life that are lost when people are just sort of crafting, vows they think are most applicable to them. And I think people who kind of understand that their marriage is a part and parcel of a larger community and a set of traditions in their own community are more likely to kind of navigate the challenges of married life, more successfully than people who think that their marriage is just about themselves or them and their intended. So in general, I would encourage couples to try to, if they're religious, to look to their own religious kind of tradition for vows. And if they're not religious, to sort of look at, just some, classical vows that I think often are kind of encouraging us to embrace a certain set of virtues that will help to sort of sustain us through especially the more challenging times in married life.
Yeah, very interesting. I think it does say something about the values, or at least how we perceive the relationship that we're entering into. So at Cardus, we've done some work on fertility and around fertility intentions and desires and outcomes. And some of that survey work found that about half of Canadian women are not having as many children as they say they want. Fertility is still very much tied to marriage in Canada. And when we asked about sort of reasons why women weren't reaching their fertility, sort of ranked reasons, like tied for fifth was don't have a partner, and sort of this lack of partner, which is fairly understandable, of course. But it does seem like, and you've talked about it a little bit earlier in our conversation, you kind of hinted at this, there definitely seems to be something kind of going on. And I know that your colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, Nick Eberstadt, has studied the decline of work among prime age men and in particular, the increase of unattached prime-age men not in the labor force, not working. And he notes that the long-term decline coincides with a decline in the fall of marriage and two-parent family structure. So he says that educational attainment is a significant factor, but married men tend to have higher levels of educational attainment. Yet he notes that married men with low levels of educational attainment are more attached to the labor force than slightly higher educated men that are never married. So I think what he's saying is, like, education is a factor, but it's not the only thing. That the marriage does play this role in it. And I guess my big question is, I guess this is an economic take from an economist, I suppose, but what, and I don't want to blame everything about marriage on men, but what is going on with men? Like, what is up?
Yeah, well, one of the striking things about kind of both my time as a professor at UVA and then just kind of inhabiting these spaces is I'm getting a lot of comments from women, kind of both on the left and the right, that indicate that there's kind of a concern about their ability to find a guy who'd be worthy of dating in marriage. And so we have kind of a lot of conversations about male marriageability. And I think what women are seeing oftentimes is that men are often not flourishing in high school or in college or in trade school. They're noticing that about a quarter of guys who don't have college degrees in the US are not working full time in that prime-aged demographic. They're noticing that a lot of guys, are spending more time gaming than they would prefer, and don't seem to have kind of like the confidence that might be more attractive to them as both a boyfriend and as a husband. So these are some of the kinds of observations that I've been hearing from women. But I think you have to kind of understand that there's a kind of obviously a social context where this is happening. And so in my book, I talk about kind of the way in which our schools are often failing boys. They're often kind of not giving boys enough recess, enough male teachers, and even kind of, pedagogical approach and substance that would kind of be attractive to the male imagination, so to speak. And so it's kind of no accident that we see that boys tend to be way outperforming girls in many of our schools today. So that's, I think, one part of the problem. I think another part of the problem is the role that big tech is now playing. We all, I think, appreciate now how a lot of social media platforms are undercutting the welfare of girls and young women. But I think the same thing is true when it comes to a lot of our gaming platforms, like Microsoft's Xbox, for instance, that teenage boys and young men are just kind of wasting hours and hours of their days throughout a given week and losing countless opportunities to do better in school, to develop a real hobby, to socialize more, to develop social skills that would make them better boyfriends and husbands. So big tech is also, I think, part of the problem. We have some unique problems when it comes to our unemployment policies and disability policies in the US that I think also undercut work. Maybe the same thing is true here in Canada. But then I think the final point is more of a cultural point, and that is that we haven't kind of articulated for the 21st century a compelling pro-social model of masculinity for young men to kind of aim to aspire to. And so I think, part of the problem here is that we're not kind of basically allowing young men to kind of rise to a certain, pathway that they can aim for that's kind of distinctive and allows them to kind of make a unique contribution in their communities and in any marriage and family that they might have as well. And I think a lot of us men are more likely to flourish when we have a clear and definable mission. And absent that, we're more likely to flounder. So I think if we want to, and this is where I think that women on the left don't quite get the whole picture in the sense that they're often on the one hand kind of decrying any idea that we would have a distinctive model of masculinity for men. And at the same time, they're also decrying the fact that a lot of the men in their social circle don't kind of measure up from their perspective. And I would say that if we want to do that, we need to figure out ways to kind of, build out, call out, speak out, a compelling model of masculinity for guys in the 21st century to kind of, raise where we're all situated for our young men.
So it sounds like to me that there's some culture work to do there, and perhaps there's a policy piece there as well.
Policy Certainly in terms of, I think, especially when it comes to education, I think more single-sex schools, more male teachers, rethinking things like recess, but also the curriculum as well. Policy also in terms of how do we deal with gaming, and that's going to be a challenge. I think we can start to wrap our heads around that as well.
Okay. I have to say that when Brian said about the national marriage strategy, that was a joke, and I was no way inferring that we want the federal government to be matching us up. I should clarify that. I don't think that would work. Very good. I think one of the things we've seen in Canada in the last little bit, let's start with more recent, is we've actually seen a decline in divorce. And I know we've seen that in the US as well. Maybe explain what's going on there, sort of in the more recent trends in divorce.
Yeah, so a lot of Americans, and maybe the same thing is true here in Canada, think that about 1 in 2 marriages will end in divorce. And in fact, a lot of it now what we're seeing is also what's called the red pill right. People like Andrew Tate and Pearl Davis are kind of arguing against marriage, kind of targeting men. They're saying that most marriages end in divorce today, and so marriage kind of is a bad deal for men. What they don't appreciate, though, is that we have seen divorce come down in the States, for instance, since 1980, and so more than 1 in 2 marriages are making it today. Probably about 60% of first marriages are going to make it today in the States. And I think that's in part because marriage has become more selective for things like education and income, but also religion as well. So the kinds of people who are getting married today are a bit distinctive. But I think there's also been kind of a recognition that the divorce revolution of the 1970s and 80s was really a disaster for our kids, oftentimes. And so people are trying to kind of avoid making the same mistakes that oftentimes their parents or now even today their grandparents did in the 70s, for instance. I think there's also been a kind of a social learning that's has helped to stabilize marriage as well.
And just on that revolution, when we look at Canadian data, we saw unilateral divorce in 1968, and then if you look at it, we see divorce is going to pop up. And we see that again in 1986 when there were also some amendments to the Divorce Act, which made it sort of quicker to get a divorce. Again, we see kind of a pop-up. So we're seeing maybe a response in the trends to a policy decision. Although in the 80s, you could argue, well, it was actually sort of backlog divorces. Now we can get them through faster, and it kind of pops them up. But I'm just thinking through sort of what we saw in sort of 60s into the 70s and 80s. What was really sort of pushing that divorce revolution?
So I think there were a number of factors that were kind of driving that divorce revolution. One was called kind of by Tom Wolfe, the famous author. The sort of the me generation was sort of the me decade was his terminology for the 1970s. There's just kind of a shift away from a more familistic mindset towards more of a me first mindset, towards doing what I want to do, what I desire, what I feel like, what makes me fulfilled, rather than sort of seeing that I've got a set of obligations to a spouse, to kids, to kin more generally that would be kind of more determinative in shaping people's lives. I think that was a big part of it. I think we obviously saw kind of a turn towards a more secular society in the 70s, kind of playing out in the US. I'm sure that was the same thing here in Canada as well. There were legal changes too to marriage law, which I think also had a feedback effect as well. It was also time too when we were kind of having one of the feminist revolutions, and people were kind of trying to understand their new roles vis-a-vis work and family and housework and childcare. And any kind of time you have kind of a major transition for men and women in the home, that can be a source of friction and conflict. So these things kind of all acting together increase the divorce rate in this tumultuous era.
And so when we look at your research, what are some of the protective effects against divorce?
So when it comes to kind of avoiding ending up in divorce, I see a couple of things in the data. So one thing that I see is, and this is kind of a pedestrian point, but I think still an important point, is regular date nights. And so couples who kind of make an effort to kind of get away, especially if they have kids in the household, and just to kind of reconnect, I think are more likely to be flourishing in their marriages and to avoid divorce. I see also that women still place a lot of emphasis on their husband's protectiveness. And I found this as a major kind of predictor of women's perceived marital stability. And when I talked to women about kind of this issue for the qualitative interviews for the book, what I heard was things like, when we're walking down a city street, like he'll walk along this, the car side or the street side, or like he'll make an effort to fill up my tank so that my car has always got sufficient gasoline in it. Or just like, he'll go around the house or the apartment at night and just, turn off the lights and make sure everything is locked. So these kinds of things were kind of noticed by women in ways that I think were, noteworthy for me. And then kind of the most salient example I heard along this score was that one woman said that she and her then boyfriend were kind of in the subway one night, and they were dating. It was late, and there were just two other guys. No, sorry, there's another couple and another guy in the subway with them. And at one stop, the couple left the subway, and then as they moved, down the subway tunnel, this guy stood up and kind of came at them, asked them for their wallets and was kind of menacing. And her boyfriend kind of stood up between this guy and her and put his arm around her and kind of like, basically, made it very clear that he was going to protect her. And then at this point, actually, they ended up in the next station, thankfully, and there were people on the platform, and they just kind of like ran out. But she was kind of very struck by her then boyfriend's willingness to kind of stand up physically for her, and that was like a real deal closer for her in terms of like moving to marriage. So, anyways, point being is that I think us husbands, should be even more attentive to kind of being protective, and then full-time employment is also a big factor. There was a study done at Harvard, and this woman, sociologist Sasha Kilowald, looked at the impact of unemployment for women in marriage. No effect on the risk of divorce when the wife lost her job. And then she turned to looking at the men in the data set. When men lost, a job, their divorce risk increased 33%. That's a big effect in sociology. And so it kind of just tells us that even today, in the kind of 21st century, that it's still kind of important for guys oftentimes to have that, that full-time job, in the context of the whole economics of marriage and family. And the final thing that I would mention just quickly is that we are social animals. Birds of a feather flock together. You've heard that phrase probably. And work done by Nicholas Christakis at Yale and some other colleagues tells us that when it comes to divorce, it's heavily networked, for better and for worse. And so if your big sister gets divorced, or if your best friend gets divorced, your odds of divorce go up pretty markedly. And by contrast, if you see your big sister navigate a tough situation in her marriage but remain married, or if your best friend is navigating some kind of challenge and remains married, then your odds of staying married are much higher. And we see this particularly kind of with reference to religious communities, and that is that folks who are embedded in some kind of church or congregation, some religious community, are much more likely to be stably married than Americans who are not religious, especially if they're religious as a couple. And I think the norms like fidelity and forgiveness, the networks that I just mentioned, touched on, friends, kind of keeping you accountable and helping you when times are tough. And then also what's called the nomos. This is kind of this idea that there's a sacred canopy that sits over religious people to some extent. And they kind of feel like there's, a supernatural force that's sort of with them and for them in tough times. They're more likely to handle the slings and arrows of fate, that are negative more successfully and not end up in divorce court. So again, regular date nights, protective husbands, stably employed husbands, religious, attendance, and then, of course, anything like, attention, affection, commitment. These are all things too that are linked to marital stability as well.
I think it was your work a little while back that sort of drew my attention to the fact that although we are seeing sort of a decline in marriage, it is not declining equally among sort of all people, especially among sort of economic and education lines. And so we're seeing, at least in Canada, we perceive that marriage has fallen much faster among lower income, lower educated Canadians as well. And I wonder, when you say like defy elites, is that maybe a little part of it in terms of like messaging that we hear or see in culture versus like how elites, and I'm not sure how you define that term, but how they choose to live their lives. What's going on there?
Right. So when the title of my book first came out, there was a kind of tart response from a journalist called Matt Iglesias, a very smart center-left guy in the States. And he said, what do you mean defy the elites? You know, elites in America are forming strong, stable marriages. What are you talking about, Wilcox? And it was a bit ironic because the book hadn't come out yet. He didn't know what was in the book, but I have a section that kind of touches on him. And he had written a piece for Vox, a progressive outlet, a while back that was sort of headline something like, the decline of marriage isn't a problem, was kind of the headline for his article. And here's a guy who himself is I think, happily married, stably married. They've got a son, and they're flourishing. And he was kind of like, in some ways, like the poster child for this tension between the way in which a lot of our elites kind of publicly discount or don't talk about marriage, in their capacities as journalists or as school superintendents or college presidents or C-suite executives, and yet in their own private lives are often living kind of very, family-first marriages. And so what I'm concerned about is the way in which, many of our elites who kind of control the commanding heights of the culture to some extent, or, maybe in Parliament here, for instance, don't actually do anything in public to affirm the more marriage-centered and family-centered way of life that they privately enjoy for themselves and their family members. And that's the kind of tension that I talk about. And this is consequential because there are public policies in the US, for instance, that penalize marriage for working-class couples with kids, the way that we've organized our welfare policies, for instance, our Medicaid especially. There are obviously Hollywood moguls and California entertainment executives that I talk about in the book who, again, kind of live very conventional family lives in their own private lives, but are kind of selling a message about, sex and love and family and marriage that often isn't particularly conducive to forming a good marriage, for the people who are viewing this stuff. And so this is the way in which I think working class and poor folks are often ill-served by the elites who kind of tend to run a lot of the institutions in our two countries.
I'm going to get into public policy in just a second, but I did want to ask, and maybe this does relate to elites, but I am seeing a lot in the media right now on polyamory and multi-person marriage, and it seems to me that this is a conversation that sort of cycles every few years, but do we have good data on this? Is this actually like a trend, or is this sort of like a fad? What do you think is going on? Why am I reading so much about this in every sort of magazine or paper?
So I do think one challenge facing progressives, they tend to kind of embrace every faddish thing that comes down the cultural pike, when it comes to families and love and relationships and whatnot. And they don't really have the capacity to kind of say, well, maybe this new thing that's just come down the pike isn't going to be good for, for adults or for kids or for the larger community. I think polyamory is one example of that kind of trend playing out. We don't really, I don't think, have really good evidence about how polyamory affects like a nationally representative sample of Canadians or Americans as adults. And more importantly, we don't really have a good, I think, data set that would kind of capture how it's affecting kids. But we do know from other research that children are more likely to be abused and neglected by adults who are not related to them, especially adult males, right? There's very good evidence, for instance, in the States that kids who are in households with adults, usually adult males who are not related to them, are about 9 to 10 times more likely to be physically, sexually, or emotionally abused compared to kids who are being raised by their own married biological parents. And so the concern I have about something like polyamory is that it's going to be introducing a revolving cast of adult characters into households with young children or adolescent children, and that I think can be, a recipe for disaster, given these sort of other bits of research that we have about abuse. And the other piece, of course, is we have a lot of work on kind of anthropological work that's been done on kind of the value of monogamy as a core social practice or institution. I'm thinking here of the work of Joseph Heinrich, an evolutionary anthropologist at Harvard, and he's just kind of in a variety of different pieces sort of chronicled the way in which monogamy tends to ensure that more men can end up getting married. That's sort of good for, for men in general. Also the ways in which kind of monogamy tends to connect men to their children in ways that benefit their kids. And then it's just kind of more of a stabilizing force in general for societies by kind of giving more men access to marriage, which in turn kind of makes them more likely to be law-abiding, hardworking, and more domesticated, if you will. So I think the proponents of polyamory don't appreciate how much monogamy has, across time and space, tended to advance better outcomes for kids and for fathers and for men, and then for the broader commonweal.
Right. Thank you. So you've been critical tonight a little bit of progressive views on marriage. What do conservatives get wrong on marriage?
So one of the things that I talk about in the book is the way in which I think for much of the last 45 years, give or take, at least in the States, conservatives have kind of had the view that the best or the only thing that they can really do for the families to kind of limit the power of government, to reduce regulations, and to kind of advance the power of the market. Now, obviously, the market is an incredibly important institution in our contemporary economies, but I think what they haven't necessarily recognized or realized, at least in the States, is the way in which policy can advance the good of families, and there are ways in which we can kind of make it easier for families to navigate the challenges of contemporary life. So I'm, for instance, a proponent of a more generous child tax credit in the States. I think we should be tackling the marriage penalty in our means-tested programs in the States. I think we could also be looking at kind of some cultural messaging too in our public schools, middle and high school, around what's called the success sequence, to kind of, among other things, kind of put the value of marriage more in front of our children. And then to be rethinking too kind of our housing policies with an eye towards making particularly single-family housing more affordable for working and middle-class families in the States, recognizing that would probably be a strategy that would boost the fertility rate too in the U.S. And people's willingness to get married as well. So I guess what I'm saying to you is I think conservatives can be a bit more open to the way in which public policy can be helpful to families, but also to kind of understand the more philosophical point, which is that the law is often a teacher. And so insofar as it is a teacher, we want to make sure that the law is aligned with a certain comprehension of the goods of marriage and family life as well.
You mentioned the success sequence there, and that's those who finish school, get married, then have kids, sort of in that order, are much less likely to find themselves in poverty, right? That's what you're saying.
Right, so the success sequence is this idea that there are 3 steps that young adults can take, are at least graduating from high school, although preferably getting some technical school or some college education, working full-time in their 20s, and then getting married before having kids. And in the States, if they do those 3 things, their odds of being poor are just 3%. But it just kind of reminds us that there are sort of 3 core pillars to financial flourishing, and those pillars are education, work, and marriage in our contemporary context.
I want to hear from those who are online. You can submit questions, and those here, we'll have someone around with a microphone, and we'll take some questions. But I want to just ask you one last question, and it really came out of something that I'd read in your book. It was actually a quote from sociologist Judith Stacy, who wrote, "Family sociologists should take the lead in burying the ideology of the family and in rebuilding a social environment in which diverse family forms can sustain themselves with dignity and mutual respect." Now, we've already talked about diversity, whatever, but what about that quote kind of caught my attention was that family sociologies should take the lead. And I'm wondering, what is the job of a sociologist? What is the role of a sociologist?
Yeah, so there are kind of 2 different strands of sociology that I sort of see. One is a tradition that really tries to sort of understand the world in a deeply, often Weberian way, kind of as it is, but from a theoretically informed perspective. And there's a kind of a tradition that's more kind of intent on changing the world, and often influenced by Marx. But I do think there's a place for both of those 2 kinds of orientations. But I just wish that our kind of more activist-oriented sociologists in family and elsewhere would recognize that kind of Marx is not the only, in a sense, founding father of sociology, that both Weber and also Emile Durkheim, the great French sociologist, have played an incredibly important role in sort of shaping our discipline. And especially Durkheim appreciates the importance of marriage and family as sort of core institutions that foster a sense of, I mean, they have their problems, obviously, both now and historically, but they've also kind of played an incredibly important role in sort of fostering solidarity between adults and adults and children, and then in terms of sort of undergirding our civilizations, as well as argue in the book. And so I just wish that our publicly engaged sociologists would be more attentive to not just sort of the downsides to marriage and family, but to the upsides. And then also, in terms of that particular quote that you mentioned, I think what they don't often appreciate is you've kind of embraced this much more liberationist agenda that seeks to kind of discard, virtually every custom and pattern with respect to family. What you end up having is a situation where oftentimes it's the state that has to move very vigorously and strongly to sort of support both the adults and the kids who are kind of navigating a world without any kind of clear normative guardrails.
I'll close with this. Richard Reeves, who's at the American Institute for Boys and Men, and I think he still has a role with Brookings, right? And you certainly know well, once wrote that when it comes to some of the most intimate decisions in a person's life, how and when to form a family, it is important to be humble about the limits of public policy. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think that law and public policy, are very important in sort of shaping the context of marriage and family life, but they're not the most important things. I think culture in this domain of life, and economics, in terms of the market, are more important than what the state does. So we have to have a certain kind of humility sitting here not very far from your parliament building to understand and appreciate, yes, what they do matters, but at the end of the day, kind of what happens in the economy, what happens in the cultural arena is more consequential for our families than what's happening from my perspective in the halls of parliament. Yeah.
So no federal national dating strategy, I guess. So. We're gonna take some questions. Monica, you've got the mic, okay? And I think we have some questions online maybe as well. So, do we want to go online first, or do we want to go in person? Okay, in person. Okay, maybe put your hand up, and then Monica will come and find you.
Thank you. My name is George Abraham. I'm here with my wife, Pamela. We've been unhappily married 32 years. Right. And I'm particularly interested in the topic of immigration. And you mentioned Asian Americans and right. Implying Asian Canadians as well. I wondered how immigration is impacting marriage, the institution of marriage in both the US and Canada. And I asked this in a very particular context. We came to Canada 22 years ago, and we didn't know anybody in this country, so we got to know people. And a few years ago, I suddenly realized that every one of those couples that we got to know in Canada are now divorced. And obviously, we got to know them because they were wonderful people. We didn't know them at all. Mm-hmm. They were both good people, but now they're divorced. And we can't figure it out. They're good people, but they're not together. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to ask about immigration and its impact on the institution of marriage. Thank you.
It's a very good question, and what we see in the U.S., and I think it's probably the same story basically in Canada, is that immigrants tend to have more stable marriages than native-born Americans, and that there's no group of Americans who have as stable marriages as immigrants from India. Right? Where are you all from? India. So your question is is appropriate in that sense. But of course, it begs other questions, and that is, what is it about American culture, what is it about Canadian culture or the West at this moment in time that is so much less conducive to stable marriages? And I do think it's, I talk about in the book kind of the sort of the shift from a more familistic mindset, in the late 60s and 70s towards a much more individualistic mindset where it's much more of kind of a me first way of thinking. And one example of this just is is about money. And we see as the couples who have separate bank accounts, for instance, in the States, are more likely not just to get divorced, but to be unhappily married, But it's just one example of the way in which a lot of the voices that are addressing, marriage and money in our culture are telling young couples they should have their own separate accounts to kind of, in the event that something goes south in your marriage, or just to kind of protect your own interests in marriage. And there isn't kind of a recognition that once you kind of start to walk down that road, if you have this understanding that you have a financial out, most couples, certainly myself included, have had moments in our marriage where we're very upset, disappointed, angry, whatever else. And if you kind of just have this idea, there's this little out that I can kind of access financially, in the middle of a difficult moment in your marriage, probably not a good thing. Or if you're just kind of thinking about how do I kind of maximize my own individual interest in my relationship, that's not going to lead you, generally speaking, to a good place. So I think there are just many ways in which these individualist currents are now running through our cultures. But I also think, too, part of the challenge is that we have what my colleague Scott Winship at the American Enterprise Institute calls first world problems. And just the way in which, affluence tends to make people less likely to have some deep kind of awareness of how much they depend upon family. If you have enough money in your bank account, or if you have enough assets, one sort or another, you're just more likely to think you kind of can just do it on your own, which makes people less likely to also kind of invest in their marriages as well, I'd say.
But sorry, big picture.
Yeah.
Moving the dial at all, is it statistically getting better?
Is what though getting better?
The sustenance of marriage.
Well, it's a great question. And I think on the marital stability side, we are seeing that marriages, at least in the States, I think probably here in Canada, are more stable, which is, I would say a good thing. In terms of marital quality, it's been fairly constant. People's reported marital happiness in a lot of national surveys in the United States. I would also say, though, too, that I don't want to kind of be entirely negative about some of the broader trends. It's important to acknowledge, too, that one of the good things we've seen in the last 4 or 5 decades is that for those married parents who are married, and working kind of together, men are much more engaged in the work of raising kids today than was the case for my grandfather's, generation in the States. So that's a good development. I think it's also one that tends to both strengthen and stabilize marriage. But there are many currents that are kind of also leading a lot of folks to not want to get married or making it more difficult for them to find a spouse today. And that's why the marriage rates come down in part. So
I think, and like the general trend, Statistics Canada released some data about 2 months ago showing that new Canadians were more likely to marry and had longer marriage duration, so more stable marriages than Canadian-born people, which is interesting, so kind of confirming what we've seen there a little bit.
Right, although it's also important to know too here that when you look at the Asian continent, what you see obviously is dramatic declines in marriage, especially in East Asia, and then fertility, especially in East Asia as well, but across basically the Asian continent. So we're kind of facing virtually a global challenge here in terms of how do we kind of make marriage and family life more both, I think, appealing and accessible to people across a wide range of national and cultural context in this new moment that we're living in this century.
And just, do you know offhand what the fertility rate in the U.S. is? A little higher than Canada?
So in the U.S. it's 1.6, and here you're saying it's 1.3. Of course, the lowest fertility rate now is in South Korea. It's 0.7 babies per woman on average, and they're now projecting that South Korea is going to have its population in this century. Just kind of a dramatic, absent like plague and war, you don't see these kinds of things, play out.
Thank you, sir, for this very good, interesting lecture. A bit of a background about myself, and I hope I can formulate my experience and my observations My name is Paul McConry, and my wife Kathleen Murphy and I have been married for 33 years. I'm a retired RCMP officer. I took an early retirement, sort of a golden handshake, in 1995 because both my wife and I agreed that one of us had to be, wanted to be, a stay-at-home parent. My wife is a professional engineer in 3 disciplines, and I do have a university degree, but I'm just a retired cop. Being a stay-at-home dad in 1995, and glad I did it, I'd do it again. As an observer, I've noticed that when I'm out and about with one child and then later on the other child with the stroller and doing all sorts of things that hopefully I'm a good father, that a good father does, I couldn't help but notice other male children being bubble wrapped. Don't do this, Johnny, don't do that. Don't do this, don't do that. Don't dare climb a tree. I encourage my children to climb trees and walk in the water on their bare feet and to walk in the grass and feel the earth under their feet. And other boys were discouraged by overprotective, willing to bubble wrap their kids so they wouldn't experience anything. Our education system, for me as an observer, has become corrupted with this new thing about, it's almost like the new normal that they talk about. You know, this whole thing there that of there's only 2 sexes. Well, it's like a social castration that's been going on for the last 25 years of what boys traditionally have gone through so that they make themselves more appealing, and I mean that in a nice way, to women who would like to have a guy who will stand in front of a mugger on a subway train and be protective and show masculine traits that historically, if I can be correct here, that women we look forward to, you know. But now, you talk about our school system is so degenerative right now. The kids can't do anything. The teachers, for the most part, are female, which is true because I'm close to various schools. I walk by the schoolyards a lot of times, and the girls the young ladies who are the guardians in the schoolyard are busy running around like mother hens, telling the boys, don't do this, don't do that, don't go down the slide, don't do this, don't do that. They're being stunted in their growth.
Yeah. So I think Brad has talked a little bit about that in terms of the way that we raise boys. For what it's worth, I'm probably the bubble wrap dad, and my my wife is the one that's encouraging kids to like race their sleds off ramps and stuff like that. But so there's a bit of like risk, maybe risk aversion or the ways that you've talked a little bit about.
Yeah, and there's also probably many of you heard of Jonathan Haidt's new book, The Anxious Generation, and there's a new group called Let Grow. And Haidt and his colleagues have been talking to about kind of like the culture of safetyism that's kind of really, gone across a lot of the parenting culture in ways that would be congruent with your observations. We're just not giving our kids, in some ways, especially our boys, sufficient opportunities to kind of experience the world and to engage in risk and, physical activity and all that stuff. So I think, your comments are on the mark in the main, and we do need to kind of revisit how we approach not just schooling, but also kind of just how many opportunities we give to our kids, especially our boys, to kind of engage in rough and tumble play and risky activities and more dangerous things that can build a sense of accomplishment and character for them.
Thank you, Brad, for coming to Canada, and thanks for all your work. I was wondering, the nuclear family gets a little bit of a bad rap, that it's isolated and perhaps isolating, and then it's contrasted with really strong friendships, perhaps, as being a more powerful and stable organizing force for society. I wondered if you knew what the data says about that, sort of friendships as a central organizing force in society versus married parent family.
So I think when it comes to the way in which a lot of our elites and even young adults can think about life, there can be this idea that kind of friends are either as important or more important than family members. But I would sort of say that it's important to kind of just understand that when you look at kind of the data for things like loneliness and happiness and meaning, we often find that kind of being a spouse or being a parent is more predictive. Certainly, when you look at like happiness in the general social survey in the United States, you find that marriage is a much better predictor of happiness than friendship. They're both important, but certainly I think we don't necessarily appreciate that marriage is often relatively more important when it comes to happiness. And there's been really a push in the pop culture with shows back in the day like Friends, and then in more contemporary circles too, to kind of see friends as kind of almost like fictive kin today. That you don't necessarily need a family, you can just rely on your friends. And that doesn't really kind of dovetail with the way in which at least ordinary people experience life. Because when it comes to like that cancer diagnosis when you're 55, or when you have dementia at 75, it just turns out that for most people, kin are more likely to be kind of standing in their corner than their friends are. So I don't want to minimize the importance of friendship, but I think just there can be a way in which in the contemporary culture we don't kind of appreciate how at the end of the day, oftentimes kin are more likely to be, including your spouse or a spouse, to be there for you and with you more so than friends. So.
Andrew?
Yeah, we have two online that I will ask, if you'll permit me, Peter John, to wrap us up. So the first question is about if you have any research on the success of marriage preparation programs that are typical of many Christian communities. So what are the successes of these programs? Are there any best practices? And what sort of accompaniment can a community offer to couples leading up to their marriage? And then the second question is a question about whether there's data on the narrowing gap in the marriage benefit between married couples and long-term stable cohabiting relationships. So this person asks, in the province of Quebec, cohabitation is more normative, while in Alberta, it's less common. Is there a gap between the benefits?
Yeah, two great questions. In terms of the first question, we've seen work done by Scott Stanley and Galena Rhodes, looking at the kind of predictors of marital success, and they find that couples who have some kind of premarital, counseling or training are more likely to be happily married than couples who don't have that training. And I think one of the dimensions of that kind of body of research is that men often have more difficulty in handling kind of like difficult conversations in a marriage. And one of the great things about some kind of premarital or pre-Cana approach to counseling prior to marriage is it gives, the guy an opportunity to talk through some difficult issues with his fiance at that point, which he can then kind of bring into his marriage, once they are married. There has also been some research done on a group called Live the Life in Florida that's doing a lot of this kind of premarital and also actually marital education and counseling that seems to be pretty effective. And one thing that's, I think, important that they really can, or that they stress, is just the importance of developing a set of skills. So it's not just kind of enough to sort of underline the importance of marriage like we have tonight, but to kind of equip couples to navigate conflict successfully, especially. And they've got a way of kind of helping couples do a better job of kind of listening to one another and seeing their partner's perspective, and then trying to find common ground. So it's kind of a skill that they talk about. Now, in terms of the second question, the gap between cohabitation and marriage, I haven't seen anything recently on the Canadian question, but I have looked at sort of the gap in marital and cohabiting stability for children, both in the United States and in Europe, in a report not too long ago. And we did find, even in more Northern European contexts where cohabitation has become fairly normal and very much a part of the fabric of family life, it's still the case that kids who are being born into married households in Northern Europe are more likely to be connected to their parents without a breakup compared to kids who are born to cohabiting couples in places like, I think it was Norway and France, for instance. So that suggests to me that, marriage is still a more stable option, even in a variety of different national and more secular contexts like you see in Northern Europe. But I haven't seen anything new on the Quebec, issue.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, Brad. It's been great to have you here, and thank you for the conversation.